Now, today, Israel seems to be moving towards a coalition government without Benjamin Netanyahu, who will no longer be prime minister if the new arrangement holds. So could this indeed be the end of Mr. Netanyahu's long career? Well, the centrist Israeli politicians Yair Lapid and the far-right nationalist Naftali Bennett want it to be. They're continuing negotiations today in an effort to unseat Mr. Netanyahu. Mr. Bennett excoriated the incumbent leader, saying he'd led a coalition encouraging hatred and polarization, which had left Israel in a tailspin. But Mr. Lapid and Mr. Bennett can only form a minority government, and correspondents say we shouldn't write off Mr. Netanyahu just yet.
Mr. Netanyahu is no more trying to form a right-wing government because he knows very well there isn't one. He wants to take the whole national bloc, the whole state, to his own personal last stand. In such a decisive moment, one needs to show responsibility. Therefore, I announce today, it's my intention to do my utmost in order to form a national unity government along with my friend Yair Lapid, so that, God willing, together we can save the country from a tailspin and return Israel to its course. A government like this will succeed only if we work together as a group. Not I, but we. We will bring back the we that was Israel's secret weapon since the day of its establishment. All parties are invited to join the government. For the government to succeed, we all need all partners in negotiations, and after that, to show restraint. Nobody will be requested to give up on their ideology, but all will need to postpone fulfilling part of their dreams. We will focus on what can be done instead of fighting all day on what is impossible.
And that's the right-wing Israeli politician there, Naftali Bennett, and he was, of course, Benjamin Netanyahu's former chief of staff. Well, for more on the latest political moves in Israel, I'm joined now by the respected Middle East analyst, Dr. Saul Zadka. Lovely to see you, Dr. Saul. Israel, of course, a country, as you know, with a long history of fractious coalitions and divided factions. Is it definitely game over for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, or we shouldn't write him off just yet?
No, not necessarily. First of all, he has 48 hours to perform a kind of a last-minute magic in which he will try to pull another rabbit out of his sleeves, maybe by persuading a few defectors to join him. So I would not write him off. He can come back from the dead. He can also be very influential on this future coalition government from the opposition, from which there is no doubt he would wage a guerrilla warfare against his opponent. But I don't see him leaving the political scene so quickly. But this coalition government is a very peculiar creature because it consists of 3 far-right parties, 2 centrist party, 1 left-to-the-center party, and 1 left-wing party. And all of them would be supported from outside by an Islamist party that is loosely affiliated, ideologically at least, to the Muslim Brotherhood that Hamas is attached to in Gaza. So this mishmash, a very volatile combination of parties, has one thing in common: a hatred of Mr. Netanyahu and a determination to open a new leaf, not only in Israeli politics, but also in the future of the Israeli-Arab conflict in the Middle East. And the icing on the cake is the fact that the designated prime minister in the first 2 years represents only a small party of 7 seats in the Israeli parliament.
Well, I mean, I have to say, it sounds absolutely extraordinary, but at the same time fascinating, just the way that you have described it. So there is no doubt, is there, Dr. Zadka, that this will be a fragile coalition if it does get sworn into government, and it'll be forced to kick some very sensitive issues into the long grass, won't it? And if Mr. Netanyahu becomes the opposition leader, that's something that he can look to exploit.
Absolutely. All these parties in this volcanic coalition would definitely neutralize each other because they are divided on fundamental issues such as the future of the Palestinian problem, the settlements, the territories. Netanyahu would be waiting around the corner for them to fail, and he will use his usual package of insightful rhetoric in order to bring that down. Because don't forget, after all, despite the fact that he is the longest serving prime minister in Israel's short history, he is also facing charges of bribery and fraud. And this is something that did not persuade him to leave office until his trial would be over. So he is using the usual cocktail of exaggerations and warmongering in order to tell the Israeli public this is a treacherous coalition government. It is weak. They would not be able to stand in front of the Hezbollah and Hamas and the Iranian threats. And that's why such a government should be toppled. He described it yesterday as the fraud of the century.
Just to take you up on that point between sort of Israel and Gaza, that the fighting, of course, between the two has thrown again this light onto the fate of Palestinians in Gaza, as well as those living in Israel. And of course, the situation in the West Bank. I mean, how much impact is all of that likely to have on this?
I guess that not much of a change would happen in the forthcoming 2 years, simply because three right-wing parties, as well as a very small left-wing party, but two main centrist parties would not be able to advance any kind of reforms. I cannot see them trying to forge ahead with a unified policy towards what has been happening in the last 11 days in Gaza. I cannot see them even reaching out to the moderate president of the Palestinian Authority, because this thing would not be allowed by the far-right movement. So the question remains, to what extent this glue that united all these parties against Mr. Netanyahu, which is a hatred of him, but also realization that he became such a badly influence on Israeli politics, not to speak about the fact that he is connected to so many corruption affairs, all this would not result in a far-reaching policy that will have an impact on the region.
So let me ask you this then, Dr. Zadka. I mean, if it does work out for them, the coalition that is, I mean, who would become the next prime minister of Israel? Who would be first in the rotation?
Well, the first one would be Mr. Bennett. He is a right-winger, the former chief of staff of the current prime minister. He will be the first one, despite the fact that he has only 7 mandates, as I said. But the reason why he became prime minister is simply because Mr. Netanyahu offered him the same. But simply because nobody is believing what we call King Bibi in the eyes of his admirer, I can imagine that this would not be even a feasible situation in which Mr. Bennett will even complete the first 2 years. But to answer your question, this next in line, completing this term of 4 years, would be Mr. Lapid, the leader of the biggest party in this coalition and the mastermind behind forging this camp against Netanyahu and the ruling Likud.
Now, Dr. Zadka, I know you touched on this briefly earlier, but I just want to drill down a bit further into it. I mean, why is this actually happening now, and will it work, do you think? Because it looks like over the last couple of years, Benjamin Netanyahu has lost more and more of the Israeli right.
Yes, absolutely. But many Israelis got fed up with him. They think that he was far too long in office. And actually, in the last 4 elections that took place in a period of 2 years only, he could not achieve majority. Only a quarter of the population voted for him. And in fact, he was the prime minister of a transitional government. So he failed, miserably failed, in 4 attempts. And what he wanted to do was to drag the nation into another 5th election with the hope that this time he would win a majority. Certainly, after this 11 days of fighting with Hamas in Gaza, he would have hoped to increase his popularity, but this did not happen at all. Not only that, the fact that he championed a very successful implementation of the vaccination COVID program, and also the fact that he, during the time when Mr. Trump, his closest ally, was in the White House, he managed also to forge an alliance with a few Arab countries, did not helping in the last election that took place in March. Instead, people were opting for even more far-right parties. In other words, there is not much trust in Mr. Netanyahu, and most of the population would like to see him go. They would be happy to see his back at the door.
So clearly this drift away from Mr. Netanyahu, as you said, has been taking place for a while, but he's always been able to, hasn't he, Dr. Zadka, which is why he's survived for so long, he's always been able to present himself as the security leader. Doesn't that count anymore?
Well, he's not Mr. Security anymore, I'm afraid. His admirers would never abandon him. They think that under his leadership, to a certain extent, they are right. The level of terrorism against Israeli citizens was reduced to almost 0. That's why they called him King Bibi. But I'm afraid that now he became a kind of a King Kong Bibi. King Kong, because he would not take prisoners. He will do his utmost in order to avenge this humiliation in which 2 of his subordinates and some of his past allies have set up a coalition against him. He would treat them as enemies. In his opinion, they will bring about the demise of the Jewish state. And that's exactly what he said yesterday.
So basically we can look forward to a very bruising time ahead in the Israeli parliament. Please stay with us. We would like to talk with you some more. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat about moves in Israel to oust the country's longest serving Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Aniagolu. So could this be the end of the political road for the longest serving Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu? Well, according to analysts, it might be unwise to strike him off just yet. But it looks like a key Israeli opposition party has backed a unity government that excludes Mr. Netanyahu. The man in question is the ultra-nationalist leader Naftali Bennett, who announced that his party would join talks to form a governing coalition with the centrist party leader Yair Lapid. Mr. Netanyahu has reacted, saying that the proposed deal would weaken Israel.
I call on the members who are elected with the right-wing votes. I call on those who have a conscience and who have a path. Go on with this path. Don't establish a leftist government. A government like this is a danger to the security of Israel and is also a danger to the future of the state. I call from here on the Knesset members who were elected with the right-wing votes, don't cheat on the public who elected you. And no less than that, don't cheat on yourselves. If you're a right-wing person, do not vote for a left-wing government. And if you vote for a left-wing government, you are not a right-wing person. This is the simple truth. Act according to it. Stand up against a left-wing government, and God willing, together we will form a right-wing government for the benefit of all Israeli citizens.
The embattled Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu there. And the Middle East Analyst Dr. Saul Zadka is still with me on the line from London. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us. And as you mentioned before we went on the break with your very incisive analysis there, Dr. Zadka, this proposed coalition would bring together very strange bedfellows from the right, the left, and the center of Israeli politics. But let me ask you what you know about this, because we're hearing that some Arab politicians could be reluctant to back a government led by Naftali Bennett.
Absolutely. And this, of course, can endanger the future of this new coalition government. However, 4 of these Arab members of the Israeli parliament have promised to support the coalition from outside, provided that some of their demands would be met, and they want to improve the quality of life of the Arab community in Israel. And this could be very timely after what we have witnessed in Israel itself during those 11 days of conflict with the Hamas and the Islamic Jihad in Gaza. However, some Arab moderate countries would be happy to see Mr. Netanyahu outside Israeli politics. And also, one can also look at what is happening in the coalition itself, because in the eyes of Mr. Netanyahu, left-wing is almost associated with the treasury. We cannot really support left-wing party in his opinion. But the left-wing in this coalition government is only a fraction, because most of the other parties, yes, consist of far-right elements, and even the 2 parties in the center consist of former army generals and some right-wing politicians. So to say that this is the left-wing party would be certainly untrue. So what we can see at the moment is the possibility that this Arab party would provide a kind of a safety net to the new coalition government, provided that they will satisfy their demands. If this is happening, it will increase the majority of this coalition government to about 65, 66 out of 120. It may give them a longer lease of life.
But I mean, Dr. Zadka, you're very experienced in not just Israeli politics, but the Middle East in general. I mean, what is your own analysis of what Benjamin Netanyahu is saying? He's essentially hinting that this could weaken, such a coalition could weaken Israel's security, that if you had a cabinet with left-wingers in it, what impact would that have on Israel's deterrent capability? And how would it look to Israel's enemies? I mean, what is your assessment of that in terms of the way that the Israeli people would generally view such a mishmash of political parties forming a coalition as it relates to Israel's security?
He was hinting also that the Arab enemies of Israel would be able to realize their long dream of throwing the Jews into the sea. I think that most of the Israeli population would not accept such a rhetoric, and many of them are sick and tired of this kind of speeches that he were delivering every now and then in order to demonize the left wing of the parties. And in Israel, the left wing parties consist of army generals and high rank officers. They are not necessarily traitors as he would have liked to portray them. I don't think that the Arab world would be looking at this coalition government with disdain. They would be seeing it as a new chapter in Israeli-Arab relations, and at the same time, they would be pushing the new coalition government to come to terms with the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank in order to resume the negotiation, not only for the sake of sidelining Hamas, but also with the purpose of negotiating seriously with the moderate Palestinians in order to bring about a kind of an end to the Israeli-Arab conflict, even by reaching an interim agreement. Unfortunately, with this kind of political parties, and especially after what was happening in Gaza until 10 days ago, I don't see this happening. I cannot see this coalition government bringing about peace in the Middle East.
And that is, of course, what the rest of the international community, the outside world, is interested in, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So if it isn't going to make a difference there, as far as the rest of the world is concerned, what's the point? But just going on back to Mr. Netanyahu, has he now given up? I mean, in terms of trying to form his own coalition government, is that now completely out of the question?
No, he keeps trying by making telephone calls to those members of parliament who are affiliated to the new coalition. He's trying to tempt them with all kinds of offers that may persuade them to do otherwise. So far, he failed in doing that. There is a great hostility also on a personal basis towards him, also because he is known to be violating agreement. And he did it quite gladly, without even flinching in the last few years of his premiership. So all I can say is that the change would be mostly domestic and not regional. And as I speak, I can hear the voices of indignation and sigh of relief all the way from Jerusalem to London, where I'm based.
And in terms of that domestic change that you're talking about, Dr. Zadka, one thing is crystal clear, and that is that this is a very murky situation indeed.
Yes, and it's a turning point. It could happen in such circumstances only in Israel. No wonder Israel is a haven for armchair bandits, foreign correspondents, dwellers of conspiracy theories, because Israel can provide this kind of stories and situation that can create imaginative elements within the region in order to think that maybe sooner or later something substantial would be happening in the Middle East alongside the Israeli-Arab conflict. I'm afraid this is going to solve a few Israeli domestic issues. But knowing the current outgoing prime minister, I can assure you that he would not give up. He would definitely be interested in changing the reality. He would not go peacefully. He would not even leave his residential palace peacefully. I can tell you about that for sure.
Well, that would be something worth watching, wouldn't it? Dr. Zadka, Dr. Saul Zadka, I want to thank you very much indeed. He's talking to us there, the Middle East analyst from London. That's it for this edition of the Arise interview. Join us again tomorrow from me and the entire team here in Abuja, Tulsa, Oklahoma, and London, England. Bye-bye, and thank you for watching.